Hi everyone, so here we are back in my home talking about Bruce Lipton's The Biology of Belief. So we won't have any mosquitoes or moths today, hopefully. So at any rate, The Biology of Belief, this classic text by Bruce Lipton. The first thing that I want to bring to your attention is that Lipton is not talking specifically about religion. He's talking about belief. Beliefs of any kind. If you're a Democrat, you have certain beliefs. If you're a Republican, you have a different set of beliefs. If you are in parallel conservative or liberal, these are beliefs. If you are inclined towards psychoanalysis, you have a set of beliefs about the unconscious. If you are into evolutionary psychology, you have a set of beliefs about adaptability and survivability and reproduction. If you're a humanist, you have a set of beliefs about human potential and growth. You get the point. This is a book about the biology of belief. And I'm going to give you the punchline right up front. I mean, you have to read the book, but I'm going to give you the punchline right up front. What Lipton tells us and what he shows us as a biologist, he has a Ph.D. in postdoctoral work in cellular biology. What he shows us at the cellular level is that determinism, genetic determinism, how our genes influence our behavior, is not hard determinism. William James made a distinction between hard determinism and soft determinism. Hard determinism is the genes directly influence the behavior. You're determined. There's no will, there's no freedom, there's no choice involved. Soft determinism, as James described it, is that there is a genetic influence, a genetic propensity. However, the main factor is the environment in which the genes function in. And what Bruce Lipton shows us is that the environment of the gene is not just this physical environment, it's our perceptual environment. What we believe is the environment in which our genes function in. So Lipton, in this book, is going to go into great detail on how one's belief becomes the environment for which their genetic predispositions express themselves. And in this way, we understand the biology of belief. So I would like to start out with the prologue, because Lipton tells us some really incredible things about his journey and about what brought him to write this book. And we have here someone who, once again, I carefully selected because of their responsibility in writing, the way that they express their ideas, and it's not in a disparaging way towards any type of religious belief or any type of belief in general. And also someone who seems to have one foot planted in spirituality, another foot planted in empirical science, rather than fully being in one or the other. So again, I carefully selected Lipton for this reason. There are many books, many authors who write about biology and belief. This is the one I've chosen to be your introduction, because he, in my mind, represents a very balanced and respectful approach that isn't common in all writers. Same as Ramachandran, a very balanced and respectful approach. We're going to see that Ramachandran was definitely more in the scientific, the neurology realm of things, whereas Lipton is in a research, not as much as a neurosurgeon, but more in a research way of thinking of things. So this is some key things let's look at the prologue firstly. So he opens up in his prologue, "If you could be anybody, who would it be? I used to spend an inordinate amount of time pondering that question. I was obsessed with the fantasy of changing my identity because I wanted to be anybody but me. I had a good career as a cell biologist, as a medical school professor, but that didn't make up for the fact that my personal life was, at best, in shambles. The harder I tried to find happiness and satisfaction in my personal life, the more dissatisfied and unhappy I became. In my reflective moments, I resolved to surrender to my unhappy life. I decided that fate had dealt me a bad hand, and I should simply accept it. Que sera, sera. We see an incredible opening statement here. This is very personal. This isn't a book that's just about science or philosophy or theology or belief. This is a personal book. He's giving us a personal statement of what was his motivation for writing this book. Incidentally, we bring up William James once again because James went through a similar crisis, described almost exactly the same, where he was in a deep depression, William James. And then he read a very famous essay on free will versus determinism. And he said that this lifted him out of his funk, out of his depression. And he gave up the idea that his life was a determined genetic unfolding and instead embraced choice, free will. And he said his first act of free will would be to believe in free will. It's classic. Let's go on now with Lipton and see what he says. In the fall of 1985, my depressed, fatalistic attitude changed in one transformational moment. I had resigned my tenured position at the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and was teaching at an offshore medical college in the Caribbean. Because the school was so far from the academic mainstream, I had the opportunity to think outside of the rigid parameters of belief that prevail in conventional academia. Far from ivory towers, isolated on an emerald island in the deep azure Caribbean Sea, I experienced a scientific epiphany that shattered my beliefs about the nature of life. What Lipton is describing here is that in order to explore new ideas in science, he had to break out of the paradigm. This is classic paradigm shift of Thomas Kuhn in his The Structure of Scientific Revolution. We'll see over and over again, from Copernicus to Newton to Einstein to quantum mechanics, that in science, the thing that shifts us into a new way of thinking, a new way of understanding, is a dismissal of the rules of the way things are being done. Because the way things are being done keep us locked into a rigid conformity. And one has to break the rules in order to make something new happen. An important lesson, I believe. He says, my life-changing moment occurred while I was reviewing my research on the mechanisms by which cells control their physiology and behavior. Suddenly I realized that a cell's life is fundamentally controlled by the physical and energetic environments with only a small contribution by its genes. Genes are simply molecular blueprints used in the construction of cells, tissues, and organs. The environment serves as the contractor who reads and engages those genetic blueprints and is ultimately responsible for the characteristic of a cell's life. It is a single cell's awareness of the environment that primarily sets into motion the mechanisms of life. He just gives in a nutshell what the majority of the biology of belief is about. If we look at a genetic influence in isolation, and we say this is influencing that, we come to certain conclusions. But if we look at the same individual living in different belief systems, in different ecologies, in different environments, we see that the genes themselves, the genetic structure themselves, the biology itself changes from moment to moment. And what Lipton is telling us is that this change is calculus, the science of change, the mathematics of change. The change of how the biology adapts to the environment, how the belief system or the environment affects our biology, how that from point A to point B, the change that takes place, that's where we should be looking, and that's where he looks. And he shows us how the expression, the biological expression of belief, and that biological expression isn't looking at a static momentary gene in a freeze frame. It's looking at the biology, the genetic biology, and how that biology is expressed over time in relation to the environment. And what is our environment? Perception. Your environment right now is not merely the room you're sitting in, it's the perception you have of the room you're sitting in. Right now, your environment is not the circumstances you're in. It's the perception of the circumstances you're in. It's your beliefs about the circumstances. So important to think about this when we're talking about belief and how that affects us biologically. As a cell biologist, I knew that my insights had powerful ramifications for my life and the lives of human beings. I was acutely aware that each of us is made of approximately 50 trillion single cells. I devoted my professional life to better understanding single cells because I knew then and know now that the better we understand single cells, the better we can understand the community of cells that comprise each human body. And if single cells are controlled by their awareness of the environment, so too are we trillion-celled human beings. Just like a single cell, the character of our lives is determined not by our genes, but by our responses to the environmental signals that propel life. So again, what he's describing here is, in the mechanistic, materialistic, and reductionistic method that sees genes as determining behavior, what Lipton is showing us and what Lipton is proposing to us is that the genes do not exist in isolation. The biology doesn't exist in isolation. That the biology is greatly influenced and adaptable to the environment we're in. And again, we're not only talking about physical environment, we're primarily talking about perceptual environment. What you believe about a situation comes to be the reality of the situation. When we have an epiphany, when we wake up and see, I was wrong or I was right, this is the moments when our perception aligns with certain, or our perception shifts about our environment and aligns differently with the environment. So we can be standing at different angles and looking at something, and from each of those angles it'll appear different. And the job here is to become aware of that, and that's how our perception is our belief, and how our belief is the environment in which we biologically unfold in. My new understanding, he says, of the nature of life not only corroborated my stem cell research, but also, I realized, contradicted another belief of mainstream science at the time. I had been propounding to my students that belief and the allopathic medicine is the only kind of medicine that merits consideration in medical school. By finally giving the energy-based environment its due, it provided for a grand convergence of uniting the science and practice of allopathic medicine, complementary medicine, and spiritual wisdom of ancient and modern faiths. Okay, so what's he talking about? Well, in the mechanistic worldview, that's the idea, in the materialistic worldview, that's the idea that all phenomenon that we exist can be reduced down to a physical substance, brain chemicals, genetics, endocrine hormones, etc., brain structures. That's mechanism. We talked about this with Ramachandran. That's materialism. Mechanism is that all these pieces fit together and create sort of a clockwork universe that we can understand how all the pieces fit together. Another misinformed idea that Ramachandran addressed. And finally, mechanism, materialism, and reductionism, that it means that if we start at the larger level, like social level, and we can reduce it down to the cellular level or the subatomic level, then we get to the initial cause of things. Now, what he's telling us here is that once you start reducing things down, Sir Isaac Newton got down to the basic billiard ball classical mechanics level. Einstein, so down to the clockwork, Einstein opened it up, and we went into eventually quantum mechanics. And in the quantum world, the subatomic world, what we find is protons, electrons, neutrons, and a lot of empty space. Basically, energy and nothingness. And this is where he's coming from. He's saying if you want to understand what the basic understanding of the human condition is with belief. Belief is the phenomenal manifestation of energy, of emptiness and energy adapting and realigning within a given environment. That is belief system. So we go from a materialistic, mechanistic, reductionistic method of science down to a subatomic level. That is energy and space reconfiguring itself. We experience this as our beliefs, or our beliefs reconfigure that. It's correlation, not causation. He goes on to say, our well-developed nervous system, headed by our big brain, is testament that our awareness is far more complicated than that of a single cell. When our uniquely human minds get involved, we can choose to perceive the environment in different ways, unlike a single cell whose awareness is more reflexive. I was exhilarated by the new realization, he says, that I could change the character of my life by changing my beliefs. I was instantly energized because I realized that there was a science-based path that would take me from my job as a personal victim to my new job as a co-creator in my destiny. What's he talking about? In determinism, that means the belief that genes, genetic determinism, that biology determines who we are. Or on its other side of determinism is environmental determinism, the idea that where we grew up and the education we had and the money we had determines who we are. Those are both forms of determinism. Free will, as we learned before, is choice. Taking those conditions and making choices that help us to transcend those deterministic views. And what he's saying here is that what he underwent through this biological investigation was the realization that belief and choice are an important aspect of who we become and who we are. The times are indeed changing, which is why I'm particularly excited about this 10th anniversary edition of the Biology of Belief. In fact, I thought about a new title for this edition, the Biology of Belief and Hope. However, I reconsidered because, like the alliteration of the original title, I like the alliteration of the original title. Nevertheless, during this time change, despite, I can't deny, a slew of negative news headlines, I am filled with hope. So what he is telling us here is that in this little preface is the gist of the book. And we're going to next turn to his introduction.